Welcome to Abide in Liberty, a podcast empowering patriots everywhere to re-enthrone faith, family, and freedom as the bedrock pillars of liberty in education, our communities, and our nation.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm glad you're here again. As promised on last episode, I want to start by responding to some of the comments that I received on my YouTube channel for last week's episode. As I mentioned then, I want to make this a sort of a conversation. So as I go through a particular topic, if there's something you don't understand or there's a weak point that you perceive in my argument, please feel free to point that out. I will read those and I will make sure to address them. The topic last week was the principle that spiritual neutrality is a myth. Now, I did get several comments. All of them were pretty obviously atheist. I ended up getting sucked into some debates down in the comments. And these debates devolved pretty quickly. In one case, one of the commenters started kind of ridiculing a little bit the idea that people could believe in the sky daddy fantasy for which there's absolutely no evidence. Some of them wanted to get into a debate on whether or not I could actually prove whether God was a Sith Lord or whether I was a Sith Lord. How could I prove that I'm not one? Comments like, well, so what's wrong with Satanism after all? So I'm not going forward, respond in the comments. It ended up kind of being a waste of time. Nobody's mind was changed. And I decided I can spend my time in those comments and going back and forth, or I can spend my time preparing my material for these podcasts. I don't have time to do both, which is difficult because I actually, for those of you who know me and have been unfortunate enough to be caught in a debate with me, I really enjoy the debate and the argument. And so turning away from that is difficult, but it's what's got to happen to make sure that I'm respecting my time and get to see my family every once in a while. So, but what I will do is go through those comments and respond to any legitimate points that are brought up or things that I look, when I read those comments and I look back on what was discussed last week, I realize, hey, there's kind of a hole here that I need to plug up, or there's an additional viewpoint here that I need to address. And I did get a lot of those types of comments that were helpful. So let's go through these points. One of the commenters claimed that atheism is in fact the neutral position and God is fantasy land. Now, a lot of the people who were commenting tried to defend that assumption, that the assumption that God doesn't exist truly is neutral. But as we talked about last week, and I don't want to get into this part of it a whole lot more, but it did bring up some other thoughts that I wanted to share. But just to recap from last week, both assumptions are unprovable scientifically. They both come down to a belief or a choice. Basically, what assumption do you choose to accept? One does not have a claim to the scientific high ground over another. And this was the whole point of last week's podcast. I want you to stop believing the lie that because you believe in a higher power, that means you're operating from a position of logical or scientific inferiority. That's simply not true. Your choice to believe is not inherently inferior to someone else's refusal to believe. In the Book of Mormon, Alma chapter 30, there's a story that I love about a guy named Korihor. This guy was a true blue secular humanist and atheist. And here's what he taught. O ye that are bound down under a foolish and a vain hope, why do ye yoke yourselves with such foolish things? Why do ye look for a Christ? For no man can know of anything which is to come. Behold, these things which ye call prophecies, which ye say are handed down by holy prophets, behold, they are foolish traditions of your fathers. How do ye know of their surety? Behold, ye cannot know of things which ye do not see. Therefore ye cannot know that there shall be a Christ. Ye look forward and say that ye see a remission of your sins, but behold, it is the effect of a frenzied mind. And this derangement of your minds comes because of the traditions of your fathers, which lead you away into a belief of things which are not so. Does that sound a little bit familiar? Now, eventually, this guy Korihor comes to the prophet Alma, and he's repeating all of this over again. Now, two of the commenters on last week's episode said to me what Korihor said to Alma all those years ago and claimed that there is not a shred of evidence to the existence of God. Now, Alma could have said what I've kind of been saying, that, both of these things are unprovable and there's really no evidence for either one. So you can't really argue either way scientifically. You have a point, but you can't disparage my belief either. That's kind of the position I took. But Alma's response was better than mine was because he's simply a better man and a more faithful man than I am. Here's what he said. Now, what evidence have ye that there is no God, or that Christ cometh not? I say unto you that ye have none, save it be your word only. But behold, I have all things as a testimony that these things are true. And ye also have all things as a testimony unto you that they are true. And will ye deny them? Yea, and all things denote there is a God. Yea, even the earth and all things that are upon the face of it. Yea, and its motion. Yea, and also all the planets which move in their regular form do witness that there is a supreme creator. Guys, there is evidence of God. This is not an unscientific endeavor to claim belief in a higher power. We've got to stop retreating anytime someone claims that we don't have proof of God's existence. We do. Otherwise, we wouldn't keep making the sacrifices that we're making. So here's how the scientific method works. You have a hypothesis. You test that hypothesis. You evaluate the results and collect data, and then you make those results and that data available to peers so that they can replicate them themselves, so that they can prove for themselves whether that's true. And God works the same way. You receive no witness until after the trial of your faith. In Alma 32, but behold, if you will awake and arouse your faculties even to an experiment upon my words and exercise a particle of faith, yea, even if ye can no more than desire to believe, let that desire work in you, even until ye believe in a manner that ye can give place for a portion of my words. Now, we will compare the word unto a seed. Now, if you give place that a seed may be planted in your heart, behold, if it be a true seed or a good seed, if ye do not cast it out by your unbelief, that you will resist the Spirit of the Lord, behold, it will begin to swell within your breasts. And when ye feel these swelling motions, you will begin to say within yourselves, it must needs be that this is a good seed, or that the word is good, for it beginneth to enlarge my soul. Yea, it beginneth to enlighten my understanding. Yea, it beginneth to be delicious to me. Turns out, God believes in the scientific method, even in matters of faith. You have to try the experiment before you get the data. And then you can share your method with others and invite them to get their own results. We call that missionary work. We, along with billions of others today and throughout history, have proof and evidence of God's hand working in our lives and of miracles in our lives. God's fingerprints are everywhere in history and throughout science for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. For those who refuse the experiment, is it any wonder that they would claim there is no evidence? They've not done the experiment, so they have no data. Your faith is not logically or scientifically weak. It's quite the opposite. Does that mean that we should force everyone to Christianity? Of course not. Nations have tried that, and forced faith, it turns out, isn't very saving, and it doesn't work very well. But it does mean that we shouldn't blindly accept solutions that remove faith in God entirely. Another comment said that by framing things as you are either with us or against us, you make it impossible to live with you if you don't hold the same views, and that this will inevitably lead to conflict, war, and death. And I just could not disagree more. First of all, I never said you have to be with me or against me. What I was quoting was Christ and God himself saying that either you are with him or against him. And I believe that's true. We talked last week about a pretty good measuring stick for determining whether we are on God's side or not. If it invites and entices to believe in Christ and to persuade to believe in God, it comes from God. But if it doesn't, it comes from the devil. Now, that's not my standard. That is God's standard. Now, that being said, maybe you are against God by that definition, but I'm commanded to still love everybody, to love and respect everybody. God said, I will forgive whom I will forgive, but of you, it is required to forgive all men. Loving doesn't mean, though, agreeing and condoning sinful behavior. Christ loved unconditionally and incredibly, even as he was being nailed to the cross by his persecutors, but he never once condoned evil or condoned sin. To say that believing in a for or against God absolute means war and death simply isn't true. And it assumes that it's impossible to love and respect while also disagreeing with sinful behavior. There's this one guy that I've read quite a bit about who lived thousands of years ago who said that if you're not with him and God, you're against him. Yet, despite his followers' desperate wish that he lead them to battle against an oppressive regime, he taught love and patience. He taught plainly and didn't mince words, yet he taught his disciples at the same time to turn the other cheek, to love their neighbors and even their enemies, and do good to those who despitefully use them and persecute them. Now, this message was so powerful and impactful that it spread throughout the world, but it didn't result in bloodbaths, at least not until that same oppressive regime began persecuting and slaughtering this great teacher and his followers. Now, I know later in history, you might say that there were nations who used this man's name to do some terrible things, but these atrocities went against everything that this man stood for. Applying a label of Christianity or Christ's teachings to devilish behavior doesn't actually make it Christianity. It is possible to believe in right and wrong, to believe in truth and error, to believe in absolutes. And it's possible to do that while living in peace with those who you believe are violating that right and that truth. And the guy who showed us how to do that is Jesus of Nazareth. It's possible. Now, to talk about one of the last comments, which turned out to be a perfect segue into this week and next week's podcast topics. And this is regarding the judge who covered up the 10 Commandments so that the jury wouldn't be prejudiced against the guy who was on trial for murder. This commenter claimed that the document should have been covered up, that was the right decision because a Christian document shouldn't be up in public. And then the same person went on to claim that our country was founded on the principle of separation of church and state and was in absolutely no way founded on Christianity. So a couple points. Number one, 10 Commandments wasn't a Christian document, it was Jewish. And second, the 10 Commandments in biblical law form the foundation of Western law. So I'm incredibly grateful for this comment because you hit on my two favorite topics. First one, is America really founded on Christianity? And the answer is a resounding yes. There is a mountain of evidence. And we're going to talk about that topic in particular on next week's podcast, but we're only going to have time to just scratch the surface of that evidence in that story. The second one, what separation of church and state actually means. Yes, it is a thing, but not the way that I think most of the world interprets it today, which is that God shouldn't be anywhere in the public and should have absolutely no interaction with religion. So let's jump right into that topic. What does the separation of church and state actually mean, and where did that come from? Now, before getting started and to really understand this, we need to define and understand what original intent means. Original intent refers to what a law meant at the time that it was enacted. Intent, as a general legal principle, is incredibly important. Intent is what differentiates between first-degree murder and manslaughter. On the one hand, first-degree murder, you intended, you premeditated, you put together a plan, and you had the intent to go out and do harm and to kill somebody. Manslaughter is an accident. Intent is incredibly important in our legal system. Original intent establishes what the law meant to those who passed it. And that interpretation of the law is the correct interpretation. But, society and our understanding changes, and you got to adapt, and you got to be able to adapt the interpretation of what it means to new changes and new ways of thinking about the world. Well, not exactly. The Constitution turns out accounted for a way to make changes as the world adapts and as we understand new things. There's a way you can change the Constitution, and it's called the amendment process. It's not through reinterpreting the law to your preference. Reinterpreting laws to suit whims and personal preferences is a recipe for instability, confusion, and chaos. And that's what we have. You have Supreme Court justices that have allowed their personal opinions about what they think it should be changed to influence the outcome instead of relying solely on what those who passed the law intended for that law. In a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Supreme Court Justice William Johnson, he said, "On every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text, which is exactly what we've been doing in recent decades, or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." James Madison also said, "What a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense." Justice James Wilson, who was one of only 6 people who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, said that the first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it. Justice Joseph Story, who was the founder of Harvard Law School and who was nominated to the Supreme Court by President James Madison, said, "The first and fundamental rule in the interpretation of all instruments or documents is to construe them according to the sense of the terms and the intention of the parties." What did the people who framed this, whether it's a contract or a constitution or a local law, what did they intend by it? It's original intent. It is absolutely a critical element of a legal system that is governed by the rule of law. All right, so now let's talk about the phrase separation of church and state. Many might be surprised to learn that that phrase is nowhere in the Constitution. It's not there. You can go look, and I encourage you, if you haven't read the Constitution recently, this would be a good time to do that and refresh yourself on it and look for that phrase. You're not going to find it. So where does this phrase come from? In 1801, after Thomas Jefferson was elected president of the United States after John Adams, the Danbury Baptists wrote a letter of congratulations to President Jefferson, but they also voiced a concern that they had with this regime change, and they were hoping to get some consolation on this point. In their letter, they congratulate him for what he's doing and think he's going to do a great job and say, "May the Lord preserve you safe from every evil and bring you at last to his heavenly kingdom through Jesus Christ, our glorious mediator." And then they go on to express their concerns. "Sir, our constitution of government is not specific. Therefore, what religious privileges we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights." So there's a little bit that we need to unpack here. So because this religious liberty is listed specifically in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the concern that the Danbury Baptists had was that because government had granted this right and it was listed in the Constitution itself, that meant that this was a government-given right. It wasn't one of those inalienable rights that the Declaration of Independence talks about. If you remember, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So there's lots of these rights out there that are unalienable. They're granted by God, and nobody, not even a government, has the right to take them away. And so the Danbury Baptists are concerned, wait, this kind of sounds like the government saying that this is a government right that we're giving to you, which means, hypothetically, sometime in the future, that same government could take it away. And that's what they were worried about. And this actually echoes a debate that was ongoing throughout the entire ratification process of the Constitution, and even in the Constitutional Convention itself. There was a group of people, a camp, if you will, that believed that it was vital and that we could not approve the Constitution if it didn't include a Bill of Rights, listing what some of those inalienable rights were. The opposing side wasn't opposing because they thought that we shouldn't have inalienable rights. They were concerned that if we listed them specifically, that people down the road would start to think that those were the only rights that there were, and that was a comprehensive list. So if it wasn't on that list, it was fair game. The government could take it. The government could trample all over it. So ultimately, the Constitution passed because a compromise was reached that, look, we'll go ahead and ratify the Constitution now, but you have to promise that the first order of business when the new Congress assembles is to put forward a Bill of Rights and present them to the states for ratification. And to cover the concerns of all involved, those who were for a Bill of Rights and those who were against it, Amendment 9 was born as a compromise. And it says that basically there are other inalienable rights. If we didn't list them here in the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean that there aren't others that the government should respect and protect. So, and this is what the Danbury Baptists were saying, that since religious liberty was granted, maybe it was granted by the government, maybe it's not one of these inalienable rights. What do you think, Mr. Jefferson? Here's Jefferson's response. Gentlemen, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law, and this is in quotes, no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Okay, so this is where that phrase comes from. Separation of church and state is from this letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And this is the proof that courts have been using since the early to mid-1900s to restrict religious liberty and remove God from the public square and from schools. And they claim that what Jefferson actually meant by saying this is that there should be no mingling of religion and government, no matter how small the crossover. They've got to be like oil and water. They cannot mix at all. And that's what he meant. And that's just simply not true. But it's important to note that right before he uses this phrase, separation of church and state, he quotes the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So where we should be focused is, what was the original intent of the First Amendment? But before we jump into that, let's just assume, for argument's sake, that Jefferson really did mean no mixture at all, not even a little bit. What one guy thought it meant back then, even somebody as important and influential as Thomas Jefferson, is simply not enough. You have to look at, what did the people who drafted it and ratified it mean by, or what did they think that amendment meant? And remember, 3/4 of the states had to agree. And in order for those people to agree, each state had to have their own convention, which included debates from elected representatives by the people. The people themselves were reading about this and reading about it in the newspaper. What did they understand this to mean when they sent their representatives and said, yeah, go vote for this? Now, it's also important to point out that Thomas Jefferson wasn't even in the country during the Constitutional Convention. He was serving as an ambassador to France. And when the Bill of Rights was drafted, debated, and passed in Congress, he wasn't a member of Congress. He was acting as Secretary of State and had other responsibilities. Now, Thomas Jefferson is somebody that I respect a lot, and he did a lot for our country in helping establish this free nation that we get to enjoy, but he just was not the single most influential founder on what was intended by the Religious Liberty Clause. But all of that, kind of for the sake of debate, is kind of pointless, because he by his own admission and by his own words, would completely disagree with the modern interpretation of his letter anyways. We also need to quickly touch a little bit on the historical background of the 13 colonies. So remember, many of the colonies were founded by pilgrims escaping religious persecution. The countries that they were fleeing had official state-sponsored religions. And this isn't state-sponsored religion like, hey, we're going to hang up some posters of the 10 Commandments in courtrooms or in schools and, hope that we get some conversion through osmosis or by just people looking at this. No, this was, if you don't go along with the state church, you are subject to severe persecution, imprisonment, and sometimes death. Think some of the early reformers who were executed for teaching something that the official government church didn't agree with. To survive, if you had a different belief, required you to restrict your religious observance to your home and even keep it a secret from your friends so that you wouldn't be turned in. Does that sound familiar at all to anybody? Atheism has become the official state-sponsored belief system. Now, that being said, it's not nearly as bad as the persecution that our pilgrim forebears had to face. Maybe in some schools there are students that risk detention for wishing Merry Christmas, but they're certainly not at risk of imprisonment or execution. So things aren't as bad as all that, but it's still not what it should be. Okay, so let's look at what this clause actually says. There's kind of two parts to it. The first is that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So first, the word Congress is really important here. This is a restriction on federal power, not on state power. Congress is the lawmaking branch of the federal government, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Now, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Basically, the federal government can't dub the Baptists or the Methodists or the Catholics as the official church of the United States. The founders were protecting themselves from what pilgrim forefathers and mothers who crossed the ocean and faced incredible hardships to escape. They were preventing that from happening again. They didn't want any more church persecuting others, no more killing people who are trying to print the Bible in common language, no more church and government leaders duking it out and assassinating each other while jockeying for political power. That's the separation of church and state that the founders wanted and that Jefferson was talking about. Now, how do we know that this is what they meant? Madison expressed that his understanding of the way that the First Amendment was written, federal government can't set up this special religion that's the official religion of the federal government and can't make any laws requiring people to observe it. You can't be sent to jail if you don't show up on church. You can't be sent to jail if you believe in something else. Again, if you think about the history of where the ancestors of these founders came from, that makes a whole lot of sense because that's exactly what they escaped when they came over to the New World. Going back to something that Justice Joseph Story said, he said that the whole power over the subject of religion is left exclusively to the state governments to be acted upon according to their own sense of justice and state constitutions. Thomas Jefferson said, certainly no power to prescribe any religious exercise or to assume authority in any religious discipline has been delegated to the general or federal government. It must then rest with the states. Oh, and by the way, Jefferson also regularly attended church in the Capitol building while he was president of the United States and after he had written that very letter to the Danbury Baptists. Do you still think he meant by separation of church and state what modern interpreters think it means? I don't think so. And his own actions and words prove it. Now, to kind of further prove this point, the nature of oaths, it doesn't seem like that would have anything to do with, faith or religion, but for the founding era, oaths were inherently religious and very significant to practically all of the founding fathers. Some of the more notable ones who talked about this were John Adams. Several of the early court cases addressed the importance of oaths. George Washington talked extensively about it. Daniel Webster did, and there were many, many more. But the basic idea was that to have somebody in government office, they needed to take an oath. saying that they would sustain and defend the Constitution. And that oath was only meaningful if the person giving it had some understanding that they would be held accountable for the fulfillment of that oath in the afterlife. So even if they got away with it here on earth, you better take that oath seriously, because one way or the other, you're going to be held to account for it. And so, someone that has that religious conviction and the concept of an afterlife, their oath means something. Now, I wish that the politicians today had that same healthy fear, because I think we'd end up with a lot fewer broken promises. Now, probably the capstone of evidence that just shows what the founding era thought about the relationship between religion and government is the Northwest Ordinance. This is an ordinance that is widely considered one of the most important founding documents, right underneath the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself. This was enacted in 1787, the same year that the Constitutional Convention was held, and this was in force for decades. So this remained in force even after the Constitution was ratified. And it basically outlined, among other things, the requirements for bringing a new state into the Union. In Article 3, it says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. In other words, if you want to become a part of the United States, you've got to be willing to, in your Constitution, put in there a provision for establishing schools to promote religion, morality, and knowledge, all of those together. And this is why the Bible was the primary reader for schools for decades, for over 100 years in our country. And no one's head exploded over it. This is why the first Congress authorized federal funds for printing the first American published Bible. The founders here saw no contradictions in this. If you understand it from the perspective of the founders themselves, that this is meant to just stop the federal government from establishing an official religion, it all suddenly makes sense. Now, very quickly, we need to look at the second half of this freedom of religion clause, where it says that Congress also cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. This is pretty self-explanatory, and all the quotes that we've already talked about back this up. The federal government cannot restrict anybody from freely exercising their religion. So I want to go back and look at some of the cases that I cited last week. Teacher can't wear a cross to school. Students can't write about the life of Christ in a school assignment. In some schools, Merry Christmas and wishing your friends Merry Christmas is forbidden. Students are punished for praying over their lunch. Does that sound like free exercise of religion to anybody here? Oh, but you might influence somebody to believe what you believe, so it's illegal. I'm sorry, but there's no unless you might influence somebody clause in the First Amendment. It's just not there. Now, I know you may not like that that's the interpretation, but not liking the original intent doesn't change what the original intent is. Personally, I love it. I think the Constitution and this protection in particular was inspired by God, and he put it into place through wise men who he raised up for this very purpose. Now, does that mean that I think that everybody should be forced into Christianity? No. And I love that the First Amendment prevents that from happening. And I love that the First Amendment grants me freedom to exercise my religion, and the federal government can't or shouldn't do a darn thing to prevent me from exercising my religion. So I think, yeah, this is a good thing, but you may not like it. And that's okay. You don't have to like it. The Constitution is built in a way for you to get it changed if you don't like it. And if you'd like to know how, Article 5 of the Constitution tells you how to do it. You've got to get 2/3 of the House of Representatives or 2/3 of the states to agree to call a convention for proposing new amendments. Then you get to propose your amendment, you get to debate it, and if you can get 3/4 of the states to agree with your amendment, you're home free. You've got your change. Now, I know that sounds kind of hard, but that's good. That was kind of the whole point of the Constitution. The founders wanted the ability to change and adapt if the vast majority of Americans agreed to do it. But absent that, they wanted to keep things stable. They wanted to make it difficult to just change things willy-nilly. And unfortunately, the way that you get to change things is not by getting some Supreme Court justices to reinterpret or reimagine the Constitution after your own image. There is no change by reinterpretation clause in the Constitution. But reinterpretation is exactly what we got. And there are a couple of major lies that were employed to reinterpret religious freedom in our country. The first one was this separation of church and state quote that we've talked about with Thomas Jefferson, just taking it completely out of context. The second one has to do with Amendment 14. And this one came about after the Civil War in 1865. The prior amendment, Amendment 13, abolished slavery, but some states still kept denying rights to former slaves, rights like trial by jury, not being subject to unreasonable searches and seizures, among others. 3/4 of the states came together and said, no, you don't get to do that. And what Amendment 14 says is that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In other words, you can't, just because you don't like this other race, you don't get to take away their stuff without due process. You don't get to rob them of rights under the Constitution just because you don't like their skin color. Now, this amendment has been used and cited in virtually all court cases restricting religious liberty, including those that remove prayer and God from schools and from the public square. And they start with a phrase that goes something like, the First Amendment made applicable to the states by virtue of the 14th Amendment. What they're saying is that the 14th Amendment, because it's protecting rights of everybody in the country, somehow makes the First Amendment restricting Congress from establishing a religion, it makes that applicable to the states. Now, again, you've got to look at what was the original intent of the 14th Amendment when it was passed. Was that debated in the state conventions around that amendment? Was it intended by the people who voted and debated and enacted this amendment to change the interpretation of the First Amendment to also apply to the states? And it just doesn't. It's not there. So in order to restrict religious liberties for the past 80 years, courts have had to, number one, ignore what the Constitution actually says about religious liberty and the original intent. Number two, they've got to take a quote from Thomas Jefferson in a private letter to a Baptist church and apply it completely out of context. And the number three, they've got to violate the original intent of another amendment, Amendment 14, to apply the out of context Thomas Jefferson quotes to the states. I mean, this is just bad law on top of bad law on top of bad law. And what I want to leave you with is that we have lost just so much religious liberty. As I've studied this over the past years, it breaks my heart to see how much we've lost. And I dream of returning to the time where we can live in the type of religious liberty and freedom that our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents enjoyed. That being said, this is still the best country in the world to live in. But in order to reclaim that, we need to first know what our rights are. Yes, we're trying to get that into our kids, but if we, the adults and the grandparents today, don't do something, if we don't know what those rights are and we don't do something to defend them and at least stop the bleeding, right? At least hold our ground where we are, if not reclaim some of those liberties, then our kids are not going to have religious liberty to defend. Now, that being said, hope is not lost. If we wake up, if we learn our rights, if we act courageously, respectfully, and intelligently, if we stand up for true principles, if we do it in a Christ-like way, we can turn this ship around and leave a better America for our kids. And then they can continue the fight going forward and leave an even better America for our grandkids. I know that that's true because, spoiler alert, God wins in the end. Freedom and liberty win in the end. I hope that doesn't surprise anybody. Now, whether we're on the winning side or not, and whether we get to enjoy the freedom and the liberty that victory will bring depends on our willingness to stand up for it today and defend it. It's time to pick a side, and I'm going to do my darndest to be on God's side. God bless, and I'll see you next week where we'll talk about how our country was indeed established with Christianity as its foundation. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to Abide in Liberty. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and share this with friends and family. In the meantime, keep up with the show online at abideinliberty.com. Also, if you'd like to help our K-12 bless and educate more families, contact us by visiting libertyyouthacademy.org. Until next time, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, and be strong.